In tonight's episode, we are going to uncover two chilling stories from Asia, stories that linger long after the lights are out. The first one takes us to the outskirts of Tokyo, where a family's summer trip turned into something far darker than anyone could have imagined. What began as an ordinary detour to a small countryside lodge would unravel into a nightmare no one in that family has ever truly escaped. The lodge was quiet, tucked away at the edge of town, its windows overlooking an old cemetery. For most travelers, it was just a place to rest for the night, but for this family, it became the setting of an experience that defied reason. On that very first night, something appeared that should not have been there. A figure, a presence, a shadow of grief too heavy for a human heart to carry. The parents dismissed it as tired eyes playing tricks, just a passing thought. But their child would remember what they saw clearly. A girl in white, standing by a gravestone, quietly crying. Silent, unmoving, as if waiting for someone who would never return. That moment was only the beginning, because what followed would consume their family, and most of all, their daughter. The summer had been planned out with simplicity. A quiet escape from the noise of the city, a chance for the family to spend time together before the chaos of school and work returned. But plans never survive reality. Their original hotel booking in Tokyo fell through at the last moment, and after a day of traveling, they were exhausted, searching for a place that could take them in. That was when they stumbled upon the small lodge sitting just outside the city, a place that felt more like someone's aging family home than a business. It was already late. The neon lights of Tokyo had faded behind them, replaced by quiet streets and the hum of cicadas that carried through the warm night air. The father seemed relieved when he pulled the car into the gravel driveway. A roof over their heads, even if temporary, was enough to calm him. The mother, tired and eager to settle down, ushered the children inside quickly. The building itself carried an old, wooden charm. The corridors smelled faintly of tatami mats and incense that seemed to cling stubbornly to the walls, as though it had been burned for decades. A faded paper lantern hung over the entrance, swaying slightly in the night breeze. The family was led to their room by the lodgekeeper, an elderly man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. The room was simple, traditional, with sliding shoji doors and a low wooden table in the center. 2 futons were spread across the tatami floor, with a third neatly folded in the corner. A single window dominated the far wall, framed by curtains that looked older than the children themselves. From that window, the view stretched out across an old cemetery, rows of gravestones leaning like tired sentinels under the dim light of the moon. The daughter, no older than 15, pressed her face to the glass. She wrinkled her nose but said nothing. The son, younger and restless, made a game of sliding the doors open and shut, laughing at the hollow sound they made. Their mother told them to settle down, to get ready for sleep. But the father lingered by the window longer than the rest, staring at the cemetery below. Something about it felt strange to him, though he couldn't put his finger on why. Night fell quickly in that place. The surrounding town grew silent, leaving only the buzzing chorus of cicadas and the occasional barking of a distant stray dog. The room felt heavier as the family lay down for the night, the kind of heaviness that comes not from the day's exhaustion, but from something unseen pressing in at the edges of the mind. The air itself seemed too still, as though the world outside had stopped breathing. For the children, the trip was supposed to be an adventure, a family getaway. But as the darkness thickened and the hours stretched on, their daughter began to feel uneasy. Her eyes returned again and again to the window, to the shapes of the gravestones that seemed to shift in the moonlight. She wondered if anyone else could feel the strangeness of the place. She wondered if anyone else noticed that the lodge, despite its age, seemed far too quiet for a building that was supposed to house guests. No footsteps in the halls, no muffled conversations from other rooms, just silence. The parents reassured them with tired voices, saying tomorrow they would head back into the city, that this was nothing more than a stopover. But the daughter could not shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the cemetery beyond the glass was not simply a resting place for the dead, but a waiting place. By the time sleep began to take hold of the family, unease had already settled deep in the daughter's chest. She couldn't name it, she couldn't explain it, but she knew one thing for certain. Something about this place was wrong. And as the hours passed, she would soon learn just how wrong it truly was. The first night passed in uneasy silence. Morning sunlight slipped through the shoji doors and cut across the tatami floor in thin golden lines. The family woke sluggishly, stretching, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Breakfast was served in the main hall, a simple meal of rice, grilled fish, and miso soup. The lodgekeeper moved quietly between tables, though curiously there seemed to be no other guests. His eyes lingered on the children a moment too long before he returned to his small duties. The parents tried to treat the morning as if everything was normal. They spoke about plans to return to the city later that day, to find a proper hotel where the children could enjoy the rest of their summer break. But the daughter wasn't listening. Her gaze wandered back to the window, back to the cemetery where morning mist curled around the gravestones. She thought she saw movement between them, something pale against the grey stone. When she blinked, it was gone. That evening, after they had spent the day wandering through nearby streets, the family returned once more to the lodge. The sun sank quickly behind the rooftops, and soon the cemetery outside their window was bathed in shadows again. The daughter pressed her forehead against the glass, her breath fogging the pain. That was when she saw it. A girl, standing near one of the older gravestones. She looked to be no older than 16, dressed in a white dress that fluttered gently in the night air, though no breeze stirred. Her face was turned down, her long black hair covering her cheeks as she cried silently, shoulders shaking. She made no sound, not a single sob, just the endless trembling of someone lost in grief. The daughter's heart raced. She whispered for her parents, her voice sharp with urgency. They came quickly, peering over her shoulder. But by the time they looked, the figure was gone, swallowed by the night. Her father frowned, brushing it off as imagination. Her mother gave a tired smile, insisting she must have been looking at shadows, but the daughter knew what she had seen. The girl's outline had been too sharp, too real to be a trick of the eyes. That night, as the family tried to settle down, the daughter could not stop thinking about the figure. She turned again and again toward the window, her heart pounding at every flicker of movement outside. At one point, she thought she saw the same girl standing farther back in the cemetery, her face still hidden, her white dress glowing faintly beneath the moon. Sleep came late and uneasy, but in the deepest hours of the night, the daughter awoke suddenly. Her room was dark, her breath heavy, the sound of cicadas gone. A strange silence filled the space, as if the entire world had been muted. Slowly, she turned her head. Her sister was standing at the window, not standing normally but frozen, her back stiff, her hands hanging at her sides, her face tilted upward as though she was staring straight into the night sky. Her eyes were wide open, glassy, reflecting the faint glow of the moon. Her breathing was shallow, sharp, and ragged, as if every inhale hurt. The daughter sat up quickly. She whispered her sister's name, then louder, trying to wake her. No response. Not even a flicker of movement. The girl at the window seemed locked in place, as if invisible hands were holding her there. Panic rose. She reached out, shaking her sister's arm gently at first, then harder, but her body remained rigid. She called again, her voice trembling, until their parents stirred awake behind her. By the time they approached, the sister suddenly blinked, turned, and asked in a flat voice why everyone was making such noise. The parents scolded the daughter for frightening them with her overactive imagination. They told her to stop letting the cemetery get into her head, that her sister had simply been sleepwalking, nothing more. They dismissed it quickly, settling back into their futons. But the daughter couldn't rest. She sat awake for hours, staring at her sister, watching the way she lay motionless, her face blank and unreadable. Something about her eyes lingered in the daughter's memory, wide and hollow, like someone looking at something far beyond the world of the living. It was the first crack in what had been an ordinary family trip, and though no one else believed her, the daughter knew deep in her bones that something in that lodge was reaching through the window. Something from the cemetery outside had already found its way inside. The next morning began with an unsettling calm. The daughter half expected her sister to laugh about the night before, to brush it away as a dream, but instead her sister seemed quieter than usual, moving through the motions of breakfast without a word. She pushed food around her plate, refusing to eat, her eyes fixed on the wooden floor as though it held some secret no one else could see. When their parents asked if she felt sick, she only shook her head slowly. The daughter watched her carefully. Her sister's face looked paler than usual, drained of the warmth it always carried. Her lips moved faintly, as if whispering to herself, though no words reached the air. The daughter leaned closer, but the moment she did, her sister snapped her head up and stared at her with wide, unblinking eyes. There was no recognition in them. For a moment, the daughter swore she wasn't looking at her sister at all, but at someone else wearing her skin. Later that day, the family went for a walk through the nearby town. The daughter kept close to her sister, uneasy at the way she drifted behind them, her steps slow and uneven. At one point, she lingered near a small roadside shrine. A woman passing by, dressed in a plain kimono, stopped and glanced at her. The woman's expression hardened, her face paling as she muttered something under her breath. She made a small gesture with her fingers, as though warding off evil, then hurried away without another word. The daughter caught the motion, her stomach twisting. It hadn't been a gesture of kindness, it had been fear directed at her sister. That evening, back at the lodge, the atmosphere grew heavier. The parents, still convinced nothing was wrong, were tired of the constant tension. They scolded the daughter again, telling her to stop frightening her younger sibling with ghost stories. But the daughter wasn't telling stories. She was only repeating what she saw, what she felt pressing against her chest with every passing hour. When night fell, the second event struck with greater force. The daughter woke in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering. At first she thought it was the wind against the shoji doors, but as she sat up, she realized the sound was coming from inside the room. A low murmur, layered and strange, like several voices speaking at once in hushed tones. Her eyes darted to her sister's futon. Her sister was sitting upright in the darkness. Her lips moved quickly, her breath sharp, as though she were arguing with someone no one else could see. The voices didn't match her own. They were deeper, older, echoing with a strange cadence that made the hair on the daughter's arms stand on end. She scrambled for her parents, shaking them awake in panic. But by the time they sat up, rubbing their eyes, the voices were gone. Her sister was lying down again, perfectly still, as if she had never moved at all. The father grew angry, accusing the daughter of letting her imagination run wild. The mother tried to soothe her, but her tone carried impatience. To them, it was nothing more than the paranoia of a young girl letting shadows and stories consume her. But then, just as her parents began to settle back into their futons, there came a knock on the sliding door. Slow, measured, 3 sharp raps against the wood. The family froze. The father moved first, sliding the door open to reveal the lodgekeeper standing in the hallway. His face looked pale, his hands trembling slightly as he held a small bundle of incense sticks. He didn't step inside, only placed the bundle on the floor and whispered, "Burn these tonight. Keep the window closed." Without waiting for questions, he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading down the hall. The father muttered about superstition, setting the incense aside with a scoff. But the daughter stared at the bundle, her skin prickling with dread. The lodgekeeper's warning had been urgent, his eyes filled with something closer to terror than courtesy. When she glanced at her sister again, the girl's eyes were open, staring directly at the window. Moonlight pooled across her face, and for a brief, chilling second, the daughter thought she saw a reflection staring back, not her sister's face, but the pale, crying girl from the cemetery. Whatever had started on that first night was growing stronger. And though no one else was willing to admit it, the daughter knew the truth. Something was moving closer with each passing hour, slipping deeper into their lives, using her sister as the doorway. Night fell with a weight that pressed against the walls of the small lodge, as though the darkness outside had seeped through every crack. The daughter lay awake, unable to shake the image of the lodgekeeper's trembling hands and the bundle of incense he had left behind. Her father's dismissive laugh echoed in her head, but her gut told her that the man's warning was not something to ignore. The air felt wrong again, heavier, thicker, as if it carried whispers she could almost hear. Her sister lay still on her futon, too still. The daughter turned her head again and again, trying to convince herself that she was just imagining things. But her sister's chest rose and fell too shallowly. Her lips moved as though forming words that never made it past her throat. Every so often, her fingers twitched. The daughter's stomach knotted tighter with every passing second. Then came the sound. At first it was a soft scratching, like nails dragging against the wooden frame of the window. Slow, deliberate, impossible to mistake. The daughter sat upright, clutching her blanket to her chest. The sound came again, louder, scraping along the glass. She stared, wide-eyed, toward the window. The curtains stirred, though the window was closed. And then her sister sat up. Her movements were stiff, unnatural, as if strings pulled her upright. Her eyes were wide open, reflecting a pale shimmer of moonlight. She turned her head toward the window slowly, as if responding to a call no one else could hear. The daughter whispered her name, voice shaking, but there was no answer. Her sister rose to her feet, moving in jerks and halts like a puppet, and shuffled toward the window. The daughter leapt up, rushing to block her. She grabbed her sister's arm, but the moment her hand closed around the skin, her breath caught in her throat. It was ice cold. Not the cold of night air, but the deep, searing cold of something that should not exist in the living world. Her sister's head snapped toward her then, and for the first time, the daughter saw the face clearly. It was her sister's face, but not her. The eyes were too dark, pupils stretching until no white remained. Her lips pulled into a grin that twisted unnaturally wide, exposing teeth that looked sharper in the dim light. When she spoke, it was not her voice at all, but a chorus of whispers layered over one another, rising and falling in eerie rhythm. You saw her, the voices hissed. She weeps because no one listens, no one believes. The daughter stumbled back, horrified, while her parents stirred groggily behind her. By the time they blinked awake, her sister was pressed against the window, forehead resting against the glass. The scratching grew louder. This time, it wasn't from outside. It came from within the room, circling them, moving along the wooden walls, as though invisible hands were dragging their nails through the grain. The father cursed under his breath, finally grabbing the incense bundle. He lit one stick with trembling fingers, muttering about humoring superstition. The smoke curled upward in thin, spiraling tendrils, filling the room with a sharp, earthy scent. That was when everything shifted. Her sister let out a piercing scream that shattered the silence. She dropped to her knees, clutching her head, thrashing violently as if something inside her fought to tear free. Her voice erupted into shrieks, cries, and laughter all at once, echoing unnaturally as though more than one person was speaking through her throat. The parents froze, their disbelief shattering instantly. The mother tried to rush forward, but the daughter pulled her back, terrified of what her sister had become. The father held the incense closer, the smoke curling around her sister's body. With each swirl of smoke, her movements grew more violent, her limbs bending at impossible angles, her mouth opening wide in guttural howls. The daughter pressed herself into the corner, her eyes wide with terror. This was no dream, no sleepwalking. The girl from the cemetery had found her way into their lives, and she was using her sister as a vessel. The shoji doors rattled suddenly, slamming open on their own. The hallway beyond yawned into darkness, colder than the night air, and in that moment, the daughter saw her again. The girl in white, standing just beyond the doorway, her hair hung like a veil, her pale face streaked with silent tears. She didn't move, she only stared, her eyes hollow and endless. Her sister's screams grew louder, as though feeding off the girl's presence. The daughter could barely breathe, her chest heaving as the air grew dense and suffocating. The room spun with shadows that bent unnaturally, stretching long fingers across the floor. The incense smoke twisted violently, no longer curling gently but thrashing as if caught in an invisible storm. The lodgekeeper appeared suddenly in the doorway, clutching a bundle of charms in one hand and a staff in the other. His face was pale with fear, yet his voice boomed with urgency. He shouted words in a language the daughter couldn't understand, throwing the charms onto the floor around her sister. The paper talismans stuck as though magnetized, glowing faintly in the dim light. Her sister shrieked louder than ever, clawing at her own skin, fighting to break free of the invisible circle. Her eyes locked onto the daughter's, black and bottomless, and for a heartbeat she saw two faces flickering at once. Her sister's and the crying girl's. The daughter's blood turned to ice. The room was no longer a room. It was a battlefield, torn between the living and the dead. And, as the smoke thickened, the voices rose higher, until the daughter could no longer tell where her sister ended and the spirit began. What was happening in front of her defied everything she thought she knew about the world. All she could do was cling to the truth she had known from the very beginning. Her sister was possessed, and there was no denying it now. The daughter's ears rang with the echoes of her sister's screams. The smell of incense clung to the back of her throat, thick and choking, as the smoke drifted in frantic patterns around the room. The lodgekeeper's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding, each word landing with a force that seemed to make the walls themselves shudder. At last, the thrashing began to slow. Her sister collapsed onto the tatami, her body trembling, eyes rolling back as sweat poured down her face. She panted heavily, her skin pale as paper, her lips cracked and bleeding from where she had bitten them raw. The parents rushed to her side, their faces twisted with terror and disbelief. The mother clutched her daughter's hand, whispering her name again and again, as if repeating it would bring her back. The lodgekeeper raised a hand, stopping them from moving closer. His eyes were fixed on the girl, watching with grim certainty, as though he had seen this before. He whispered one final phrase, softer than the rest, and slowly lowered his staff. For a moment, the room was silent again. Then, he turned his gaze toward the family. His face was tight with fear, but behind it was something else, pity. He looked at the daughter first, the one who had seen everything from the beginning. "You were right," he said quietly. "This place is not safe for your sister. It never was." The father bristled, still clinging to reason even as the impossible unfolded before him. "What are you talking about? What did you just do to her?" His voice cracked under the weight of panic. The lodgekeeper didn't flinch. "I tried to push it back, to keep it from taking more than it already has. But this spirit, it is not a wandering soul. It is bound. And your sister, she was chosen. The daughter felt her stomach twist. Chosen for what? The old man's eyes flicked toward the window. The curtains had parted during the chaos, and beyond them, the cemetery stretched endlessly into the night. Moonlight gleamed off the gravestones, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. "There is a girl who lingers here," he said, his voice low. "She died young. Some say by her own hand, others whisper she was abandoned. It doesn't matter which story is true. What matters is that she was buried here, forgotten, her spirit left restless. She waits, always waiting, for someone who can carry her pain." The daughter's mind spun back to that first night, to the figure in the white dress weeping by the stone. The pieces began to fall into place, each memory reframed by the old man's words. The way her sister had frozen at the window, the voices whispering in the dark, the stranger on the roadside who had made that sign of protection. None of it had been chance. The spirit had chosen her sister the moment they set foot in that lodge. The mother shook her head violently, clutching her daughter tighter. "No, this is nonsense. She's just sick. She needs a hospital, not—" Her words were cut short when her daughter's body convulsed suddenly, a violent shudder that knocked her head back against the floor. Her eyes snapped open, and once again, they weren't hers. Black, hollow, endless. Her lips curled into a faint, eerie smile, and when she spoke, the voice was not her own. "She was alone," the spirit whispered through her. "No one listened, no one believed, and now she is mine." The room grew colder, the tatami beneath their knees almost burning with its chill. The parents recoiled, their belief finally shattered, fear consuming their faces. The father looked back at the lodgekeeper, his voice breaking. "What do we do? How do we stop this?" The old man shook his head. "There is no stopping what she wants, only bargaining. She must be given release, or she will take what she desires. Your daughter is the vessel she has chosen, and if she is not freed, the spirit will never let her go." The daughter's heart pounded as she stared at her sister. Her mind screamed with questions. Why her? Why their family? Why this place? But deep down, she already knew the answer. It wasn't random. The girl in white hadn't appeared to her that first night by accident. She had been trying to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be believed, and the daughter had seen her. The lodgekeeper reached into his robes and pulled out another set of charms, placing them gently in the daughter's hands. "If you want to save her, you must confront it. She chose your sister, but she noticed you. That may be the only reason you are all still alive." The daughter's fingers trembled as she clutched the talismans, the weight of responsibility sinking into her chest. The spirit's words echoed in her head, haunting and sorrowful. No one believed. It all made sense now. Every strange event, every warning, every whisper had been leading to this moment. The girl in white wasn't just haunting the cemetery, she was searching. Reaching out with grief that twisted into rage, looking for someone to carry her story. The daughter realized with dawning horror that her sister's suffering was never the beginning. It was only the spirit's way of demanding to be heard. And though the old man had revealed fragments of truth, the full answer still hung in the air like smoke. Would acknowledging the spirit release her, or would it only drag them all deeper into her sorrow? The incense burned low, the smoke thinning, but the chill in the room did not fade. The daughter knew only one thing with certainty. Whatever happened next, they were standing on the edge of something that could not be undone. The room felt thinner after the revelation, as though the walls themselves had drawn back, leaving only emptiness. The parents clung to their daughter, But the girl's body was limp, her breaths shallow, her eyes fluttering in and out of consciousness. The lodgekeeper urged them to leave, his voice low and urgent. "Do not stay here another night. Take her away before the spirit binds completely." The father wasted no time. Bags were hastily packed, futons left in disarray. The mother wept silently as she wrapped her arms around the weakened girl, carrying her as if she were a child again. The daughter lingered, her eyes drawn one last time to the window. The cemetery outside was bathed in silver moonlight. For a moment, she thought it was empty. But then she saw her, the girl in white, standing perfectly still, her face tilted upward, her long black hair swaying gently, though the air outside was calm. This time, she wasn't crying. She was smiling, a soft, eerie curve of lips that sent ice straight into the daughter's chest. Her sister stirred faintly, and in that whisper-thin voice that wasn't fully hers, she spoke words that froze everyone in place. She said she will follow. The lodgekeeper dropped his gaze to the floor, refusing to meet their eyes. He pressed a final charm into the daughter's hand, murmured a prayer, and urged them to go. The family stumbled into the night, the cicadas silent, the air unbearably cold despite the summer season. The lodge behind them loomed like a shadow they could never return to. They drove without speaking, the car rattling down the narrow roads back toward the city. The daughter glanced at her sister in the back seat, pale and silent, her head resting against their mother's shoulder. For a moment, she looked peaceful, almost herself again. But then, in the reflection of the car window, the daughter saw something that made her blood run cold. A second face, hovering just behind her sister's, pale, hollow-eyed, with that same thin smile. The daughter looked away, clutching the charm so tightly it cut into her skin. Her parents told themselves it had been stress, exhaustion, an illness they couldn't name, but she knew the truth. The girl in white had found them. And she wasn't finished yet. What makes these stories so unsettling is how easily they blur the line between imagination, belief, and something far more sinister. In Tokyo, it was a family holiday that turned into a nightmare, a single spirit reaching through the veil to claim a life. But possession isn't always so isolated, so quiet. Sometimes it spreads like fire, consuming not just one person, but an entire household. Our next story takes us to Taiwan, where a family in Kaohsiung became convinced they were vessels for gods and deities. What began with a warning from a daughter spiraled into starvation, rituals, and a death that left the whole neighborhood shaken. Was it divine power, madness, or something far darker? Let's step inside the Kaohsiung house and find out. Kaohsiung, in the mid-2000s, was a city alive with noise and color. Neon lights from night markets lit up the streets, scooters weaved in endless streams, and incense smoke curled up from temples that dotted the neighborhoods. But tucked away in one of the quieter residential districts stood a house that soon no one wanted to walk past. A house where gods, demons, and madness seemed to blur into one. The family who lived there appeared ordinary at first glance. A father, a mother, a son, and 2 daughters. They were not wealthy, but they were respected, known for running a small shop on the corner and attending temple festivals like everyone else. Yet behind closed doors, something far from ordinary began to stir. It started with the youngest daughter. Barely a teenager, she was playful, outspoken, always the first to speak her mind. But one evening, during what should have been a simple family meal, she fell silent. Her eyes glazed over, her voice dropped into a tone no one had ever heard from her before, and she declared she was no longer herself. She claimed she was possessed by Nezha, the fiery Taoist deity, a protector of youth and punisher of evil. The words poured out of her with a confidence that unsettled everyone in the room. And then came the warning. If her older sister did not come home soon, she would die. The family froze at the declaration. The older sister had been living away, working long hours to help support them, and the threat sent shivers through her parents. At first, they brushed it off as childish nonsense, the dramatics of a girl who had perhaps read too many stories from temple scrolls. But the unease lingered. And when the older sister did return home a few days later, something even stranger began to unfold. She too began to change. At first it was murmurs in her sleep, words that didn't sound like her own. Soon she was speaking openly in a soft, melodic tone, claiming she was no longer just herself, but inhabited by Guanyin, the bodhisattva of compassion. Her parents listened, bewildered, as their once practical daughter now sat cross-legged in the living room, eyes closed, speaking prayers and warnings in voices that felt ancient. The atmosphere of the house began to shift. Shadows clung longer to the corners of the rooms. The air grew thick with the smell of incense that the family burned constantly. Neighbors began to notice the change as well. They no longer saw the family in the streets or at the market. Windows stayed shuttered even during the day. When people passed the house at night, they swore they could hear chanting drifting through the thin walls, sometimes joined by strange laughter or cries. It was as though the house had sealed itself off from the rest of the world. What had begun as one daughter's possession now spread like a fever. The father claimed he had become the Jade Emperor himself, ruler of heaven. The mother insisted she was the Queen Mother, a goddess of immortality. Their son declared he was a living Buddha. Each one took on a divine role, speaking with authority, their voices carrying the weight of gods. To the outside world, it looked like madness, but inside the house, to them, it was a sacred duty. They believed they had been chosen, that the heavens had descended into their home. They locked their doors, shut out the doctors and priests who came knocking, and turned inward, feeding only on salt and rice to purify their bodies. The city beyond their walls moved forward with its chaos and light. But inside that small Kaohsiung house, something ancient was rising. And whether it was holy or unholy, no one could yet decide. All they knew was that a family once ordinary was now staring into the abyss of gods and demons and calling it home. It began quietly, almost too quietly for anyone to notice. After the youngest daughter's strange declaration that Nezha had chosen her, the family tried to continue their routine. Meals were eaten together, the shop was still opened, though less frequently, and neighbors still caught brief glimpses of them sweeping the front step or buying incense from the temple stalls. But inside, a current was shifting. Something was tightening around them like an invisible grip. The older sister was the first to feel it. She had returned home after her siblings' warning, shaken but unconvinced. Yet, not long after, she began to lose herself in moments of trance. She would stare into space, lips moving in prayer-like murmurs, until finally the words spilled out in full. "Guanyin walks with me," she whispered one evening at the dinner table, her voice trembling yet serene. "I am her vessel. She speaks through me." Her parents exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how to respond. Their son laughed nervously, but the sound faltered as she turned her eyes toward him, calm, unblinking, carrying a weight he had never seen in his sister before. She was no longer speaking like a young woman trying to imitate scripture. She was speaking with the authority of someone who believed, utterly and completely, that she had been chosen by a goddess. That night, the first complication revealed itself. The youngest daughter awoke in the middle of the night, screaming, her voice sharp enough to jolt the entire household from sleep. When they rushed to her side, they found her sitting upright, her hands clawing at the air as though she were trying to fend something off. Her words came in a torrent, harsh and fevered, claiming unseen enemies surrounded the house. "They want her," she cried, pointing toward her sister. "They want to take her, but I will protect her. Nezha will protect her." The parents tried to calm her, but she thrashed violently, eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. Then, just as suddenly as it began, she collapsed into silence, her chest heaving, sweat dripping down her forehead. The house grew cold after that, the silence ringing too loudly. The family exchanged fearful looks, but no one dared to speak. In the days that followed, the atmosphere worsened. The older sister's trances deepened. Sometimes she spoke words that weren't her own, ancient verses that neither parent could recognize. At other times, she seemed to drift entirely, her eyes distant, her body trembling as if she carried some unbearable weight. She claimed Guanyin whispered to her, guiding her, warning her of dangers that no one else could see. Then the son began to change. He had been mocking at first, rolling his eyes when his sisters spoke of gods. But soon he too began to mutter strange things, his voice taking on a rhythm not his own. One evening he declared calmly, "I am the living Buddha. I was sent here to witness." His parents, instead of denying it, looked at one another in stunned silence. The seed of belief, planted by fear, was already sprouting. The neighbors began to notice something was wrong. They knocked at the door, asking if everything was all right, offering fruit or medicine, but the father began refusing them, his voice harsh, his words clipped. "We need no help," he told them. "The Jade Emperor provides." His hands trembled as he shut the door, and for the first time, the neighbors felt real unease. That night, the family gathered in the living room, incense burning thick in the air. They sat cross-legged in a circle, whispering prayers, the smoke curling around them like a cage. The daughter who claimed to be Guanyin raised her hands and began chanting in a voice that was not fully her own. The others followed, each speaking with a conviction that frightened even themselves. It was no longer one strange declaration, no longer a single child's imagination. It was spreading, slowly consuming them, pulling them all into something they couldn't quite resist. The parents should have stopped it then. They should have opened the doors, let doctors or priests in, but instead, they began to feel the pull as well. The mother claimed she felt the presence of the Queen Mother within her, whispering secrets of heaven. The father closed his eyes and declared he had seen visions of the Jade Emperor, commanding him to guide his family into purity. What had started as a child's warning was now a storm cloud gathering above the household, and though no harm had yet fallen, the air itself felt charged, waiting for the first strike. The neighbors would later say this was when the house stopped feeling alive. Its shutters stayed closed, its doors locked, and even in the middle of summer, the sound of chanting replaced the hum of cicadas. Something inside was changing, and though it was not yet deadly, it had already crossed the line between strange and dangerous. The days inside the Kaohsiung house grew longer, heavier, as though time itself had been slowed by the smoke of constant incense. The air clung to the lungs, thick and choking, while chants and muttered prayers echoed endlessly from room to room. What had begun as isolated declarations now twisted into a shared reality. The family was no longer simply speaking as themselves. They were living as gods. The neighbors whispered about it first. Strange sounds were heard late into the night, chanting in overlapping voices, sudden bursts of laughter that ended in wails, the banging of doors and walls as though some unseen force shook the house. One woman claimed she saw the mother through a window, kneeling on the floor and rocking back and forth, her hands raised toward the ceiling while salt spilled from bowls scattered around her. "She didn't blink," the woman murmured later. Her eyes were wide, fixed, as though she wasn't seeing this world at all. Inside, the second strange event unfolded in terrifying detail. The older sister, the one who claimed to embody Guanyin, stopped eating entirely. For days she refused food, saying her body was a vessel too sacred for ordinary meals. She allowed only small handfuls of salt and rice, which her parents solemnly placed before her as though it were an offering at a shrine. Her lips cracked, her skin grew pale, but her voice carried on in the soft, lilting tone of a deity. She spoke of coming storms, of dangers waiting beyond the door, of shadows that would claim them if they faltered. Her words soothed the family even as they terrified them, binding them tighter to the delusion. The son, now convinced of his identity as a living Buddha, began to challenge her. His voice grew louder in the nightly rituals, his words contradicting hers. Where she spoke of compassion, he warned of punishment. Where she wept for suffering souls, he laughed, saying the suffering was necessary for purification. The siblings clashed in their visions, shouting prayers at one another as their parents watched helplessly, caught between divine voices spilling from their own children's mouths. This conflict only fed the atmosphere of dread. The daughter who first claimed Nezha was restless, pacing the halls at night, muttering about enemies clawing at the walls. At one point, she struck the floor repeatedly with a broomstick, shouting that she was driving demons back into the earth. When her parents tried to stop her, she bit her own hand until blood dripped down her wrist, screaming Nezha would never abandon her. By then, the neighbors could no longer ignore it. They gathered outside the house one evening, voices low, debating whether to call the police. Some insisted it was a case of spiritual possession, that priests should be summoned. Others said it was madness, nothing more than starvation and hysteria. But before anyone could decide, the father stormed out onto the porch. His face was pale, his eyes wild. He pointed at the crowd and declared in a booming voice, "You stand before the Jade Emperor. Do not interfere, or heaven's wrath will strike you down." The crowd fell silent, unsettled. He was shaking, sweat dripping down his face, but the conviction in his words was undeniable. No one dared move closer. That night, as the family locked themselves back inside, a strange warning came from the older sister. She spoke in her hollow, ethereal tone, her voice carrying through the walls so even the neighbors outside could hear it. "One will be taken," she intoned. "One must be offered. Only then will the heavens be satisfied." The neighbors, horrified, fled from the house. The next morning, rumors spread like wildfire. People claimed the family had crossed into something unholy, that the gods they invoked were not protecting them, but consuming them. Inside, the family only drew further inward. The father and mother no longer allowed outsiders to approach. They barricaded the doors, shuttered the windows, and sank deeper into their rituals. Salt lined the thresholds, rice bowls filled every corner, and incense burned until the walls turned black with soot. The house had become a shrine, a prison, and though no blood had been spilled yet, the warning hung over them like a curse. Someone in that family would be taken. The only question left was who. The Kaohsiung house had by now ceased to resemble a home at all. The curtains remained shut, trapping incense smoke so thick it clung to clothing and hair, and the floors were littered with bowls of salt and rice, as if the very walls needed to be purified. The neighbors no longer knocked. The police had already tried once to check on the family, only to be met by the father, who shouted scripture until his voice cracked and his body shook. He drove them back into the street, declaring that earthly authority had no power here. Inside, the rituals grew more frenzied, more consuming. Days bled into nights without distinction. The older sister sat cross-legged at the center of the living room, her body thin and frail, her lips perpetually moving with whispers that seemed too steady, too inhuman, for someone so weak. She claimed Guanyin was guiding them, but her voice no longer sounded like her own. At times it was deep and commanding, at others high and shrill, a chorus of tones layered one over another. The son stood opposite her, his eyes wide and bloodshot, proclaiming himself the living Buddha with a manic conviction. He no longer laughed but shouted, his voice breaking through the chanting like thunder. He accused his sister of betraying the divine mission, claimed her compassion was weakness, that true purification required sacrifice. Their words clashed in the stale air, overlapping, until even the parents seemed dazed by the noise. The youngest daughter, still calling herself Nezha, began pacing the room in frantic circles. She banged her fists against the walls, shouting that demons were clawing their way inside, demanding blood. Her body twitched violently, and at one point she collapsed, her eyes rolling back. When she rose again, her mouth curled into a grin so twisted it looked alien on her young face. The parents had long since abandoned doubt. The father, in his fevered state, bowed before each of his children as though they truly were gods, muttering that he was the Jade Emperor, the ruler of all. The mother sobbed as she rocked back and forth, cradling bowls of rice against her chest, whispering prayers to the Queen Mother of Heaven. Every movement, every breath, was consumed by the belief that their house was now the site of a divine battle between gods and demons. Then came the night when everything reached its breaking point. The older sister, already weak from starvation, collapsed mid-ritual. Her body struck the floor with a dull thud, and for a moment, silence fell over the house. The family crowded around her, their faces pale, their hands trembling. She wasn't moving. Her breaths were shallow, almost non-existent. Then, without warning, her eyes snapped open. But it wasn't her eyes that looked back at them. They were dark, hollow, stretching too wide, as if the void itself had seeped into her. Her lips moved, but the words that spilled out weren't prayers. They were commands. Harsh, guttural sounds in a dialect none of them understood, yet every syllable carried with it a weight that pressed against their skulls like an iron grip. The son screamed that she had been overtaken by false gods, his voice rising above hers. He threw salt across the room, shouting that he would cleanse the evil. The youngest daughter joined him, thrashing wildly, her body jerking like a puppet on strings. The father roared scripture until his voice cracked, while the mother began tearing at her own clothes, as if trying to strip away some unseen corruption. The house became a chaos of wailing, chanting, shrieking. Every voice was layered over the next until it sounded as though 1,000 mouths spoke at once, the walls themselves trembling under the weight of it. Neighbors gathered outside, drawn by the noise, but none dared enter. Through the thin walls they could hear it, the overlapping cries of gods, demons, and the desperate. And then the older sister screamed. It wasn't the scream of a young woman. It was something deeper, raw, inhuman. The sound pierced through the house, silencing even her frenzied family. Her body convulsed violently, her limbs twisting unnaturally. Foam bubbled at her lips. Her eyes rolled back once more, leaving only the whites as she clawed at the floor like an animal. The parents clutched each other, sobbing, but they did not call for help. They believed this was the sacrifice foretold, that the heavens were taking what was owed. The neighbors outside pounded on the doors, screaming for the family to open up, but the sound was drowned out by the storm inside. The daughter's body arched backward, her spine bending until it looked as though it might snap. Her voice rose in one final wail that carried far beyond the walls of the house. And then, with terrifying suddenness, she collapsed in silence. The chanting stopped, the banging stopped. Even the youngest daughter froze, her mouth half open in mid-cry. The family stared at the motionless body of their eldest, their eyes wide, their faces blank. For the first time in weeks, the house was completely still. But in that stillness, one question hung heavier than all the rest. Had they been touched by the divine, or had something far darker consumed them all? When the eldest daughter collapsed for the final time, the silence inside the Kaohsiung house was suffocating. The incense still smoldered in its bowls, smoke curling upward in thin ribbons, but the chanting was gone. The family stared at her body, pale and motionless on the tatami floor, as though time itself had stopped with her last breath. It was the mother who broke first. She fell over her daughter, sobbing, pressing her ear against the girl's chest for any sign of a heartbeat. But there was nothing. only stillness, only the faint scent of sweat and ash rising from her fragile body. The father staggered back, his hands shaking violently. He had spoken for weeks with the authority of the Jade Emperor, his words booming as though they carried heaven's decree. But now, his voice was a whisper. "It has been taken," he murmured. "The heavens demanded her, and they have taken her." The son shouted in response, his body trembling with fury. "No, that wasn't heaven. That was a demon wearing the mask of gods. We were deceived." His voice cracked as he hurled salt across the floor, scattering it over his sister's body. The grains clung to her damp skin like a final shroud. The youngest daughter sat in the corner, rocking back and forth. Her voice was high, childish, yet it carried the same eerie conviction. "Nezha warned us. One would be taken. One had to die. Now the balance is restored." The words echoed, settling into the thick silence like nails driven into wood. The neighbors outside, alarmed by the sudden quiet, pressed their ears to the walls. For the first time in weeks, they could hear muffled sobbing instead of frenzied prayers. Some whispered that perhaps the possession had ended, that whatever force had gripped the family had finally released them, but others weren't so sure. There was something unsettling about the quiet, something that felt less like relief and more like aftermath. When police finally forced their way inside, the scene that greeted them was unforgettable. The house was dark, windows sealed, air thick with incense and sweat. Bowls of salt and rice covered nearly every surface, and at the center lay the eldest daughter's body, her limbs twisted unnaturally, her lips stained with blood from where she had bitten through them during her convulsions. The parents clung to her as though the officers were intruders defiling holy ground. They shouted that the gods had spoken, that outsiders had no right to interfere. The son accused the police of bringing demons with them. The youngest daughter clutched her knees to her chest, whispering over and over that Nezha had saved them. The police, horrified, dragged the family out one by one. Yet even in the harsh daylight, none of them broke from their delusions. The father continued to proclaim his divine identity. The mother wailed prayers into the sky. The son cursed the officers, spitting words of scripture like daggers. And the youngest daughter, her face pale but calm, smiled faintly as she repeated her warning. One had to die. One always has to die. Doctors who examined the family later argued it was a case of mass hysteria, a shared psychosis fed by starvation, isolation, and religious fervor. They pointed to the self-imposed diet of salt and rice, the constant incense inhalation, the endless chanting that blurred the line between sleep and waking. In their reports, it was the perfect storm for a family to lose themselves entirely. But priests who were brought in to purify the house told a different story. They described the atmosphere inside as heavy and unnatural, as though sorrow and rage had seeped into the walls themselves. One priest claimed he felt watched the entire time, his skin crawling until he could hardly complete the ritual. Another whispered afterward that the eldest daughter's death had not been mere starvation, that her body bore signs of something ridden from within. Neither explanation satisfied the neighbors. To them, the family had not simply gone mad. They had been chosen, or cursed, by forces too great for ordinary people to understand. And the whispers grew that the eldest daughter had not died of weakness, but had been claimed, that her collapse had been the final act of a possession too powerful to resist. For the daughter who first spoke as Nezha, the story was simple. She told anyone who would listen that her warning had been true, that she had tried to protect her sister, but the gods had taken what they demanded, and in her eyes, wide and unwavering, there was no doubt she believed it. The tragedy reframed every detail, the chanting, the salt, the rituals that once seemed absurd. Suddenly they became ominous signs of a family caught in a grip they could never escape. Was it hysteria? Was it divine punishment? Or was it something else entirely, an unseen force that slid quietly into a household and whispered itself into every ear until death was the only resolution? The Kaohsiung house was eventually abandoned, but locals still avoid walking near it at night. They say it feels colder there, that the air is heavy, that sometimes you can hear faint murmurs behind the boarded windows. And always, someone adds the same chilling question. If one had to die to satisfy the gods, what happens if they ever demand another? The Kaohsiung house stood silent after the tragedy, but silence does not mean peace. The eldest daughter was gone, her body carried out under the flashing lights of ambulances, but the rest of the family remained eerily unchanged. Even as officials dragged them away, their words did not falter. The father still claimed he was the Jade Emperor. The mother whispered prayers to the Queen Mother. The son spoke in the voice of a living Buddha, his eyes distant. And the youngest daughter smiled faintly, repeating the same chilling phrase, "One had to die, one always has to die." The neighbors, shaken and horrified, avoided the house from that day forward. Curtains were drawn, the doors sealed, but whispers spread across Kaohsiung like wildfire. Some said the family had gone mad. Others swore they had witnessed true possession, that the gods had chosen that house as their stage and the eldest daughter as their sacrifice. The police eventually released the surviving family members back into the world, but they were never quite the same. They walked the streets slowly, heads bowed, their lips still moving with endless prayers. People crossed to the other side when they saw them coming. Some swore that if you looked into their eyes, you could see a shadow flicker there, something that wasn't entirely human anymore. And the house itself, abandoned, windows boarded, became a place of quiet dread. Children dared each other to step onto the porch at night. Stray dogs avoided it completely. Those who passed claimed to hear faint whispers drifting from the cracks in the wood, the overlapping tones of a family that never stopped chanting. The official reports called it starvation, stress, shared delusion, but the locals still lower their voices when the story comes up, because the question that lingers is the one no one dares to answer. If the gods were truly speaking through that family, then was the eldest daughter's death enough to satisfy them? Or is the Kaohsiung house still waiting, patient in its silence, for another offering? I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you like them and want to listen to more, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.